Hi, Misha here, and I did consider doing this one with the T-64, but you know what? The T-62 has been overshadowed by later tanks enough, so let's give it its own video. And if this looks very, very similar to the T-55, even the T-54, there's a very good reason for that. This was yeah, we'll just talk about it, but a successful failure, I don't know, intermediate design, underwhelming, yet still effective. But it was the first to have a smooth bore gun in Russia. That's kind of really what it was built around. And it's also built around the whole competition from the OKB design team and the Morozov design team with their different kind of competing designs based on the T-54, T-55 series. And of course, it's Soviet Russia, so politics. And on to the spinny thingy. And this model's from Eagle Moss Fabry, and it's the only one of the T-62 I could find in one 72 scale diecast, in fact, in any scale. Not quite forgotten, it does kind of suffer middle child syndrome. But, yeah, it wasn't all that bad. Going back to the 1950s, in 57, 58, the Kharkov Design Bureau was working on Object 140. And this was abandoned for a few different reasons. Instead, we ended up with Object 155, which became the T-55. The Morozov Bureau was working on Object 430, and actually for a much longer period of time. And they wanted to combat new Western armor and new Western tanks, and just integrate new technologies into the tank design. So things were going apace. We had two kind of competing design concepts, one more of a evolution of the T-54, T-55, and more of a revolutionarily new design. Well, in the end, time kind of ran out. Now, going to the OKB Bureau, the Object 140 didn't work out. The Object 155 was turned into the Object 165, which was the same but a little bit longer hull, and it had the kind of cast turret, often described as egg-shaped, from the 140. But this kept a rifled gun. It was actually the Object 166 that introduced the smoothbore, which was a 115 millimeter gun, the U5 TS called the Molot. And it was essentially a bored out 100 millimeter gun, but that's neither here nor there. And this was a kind of compromise. It did have better armor penetration, and it had better range and whatnot, but it did lose out on accuracy. In fact, a later report from the USA said that close in, 1,000, 1,500 meters, it was actually more accurate than the early guns used on the M60. But out past that, 2 kilometers more, it was actually less accurate. They also took the opportunity to do a few other things, like increase the armor a bit, only about 15% in the front of the turret, and only about 5% in the kind of hull there, and change things up a wee bit. But it was just, small steps forward. It was also slightly faster, about 50 kilometers an hour, so 31, 32 miles per hour on road. And it was slightly heavier, 37 tons, so about a ton heavier. That's a little bit of unfortunateness because it used the same engine as the T-55, so it was actually a little bit less maneuverable and maybe took a little longer to get up to top speed. In fact, it used a lot of the same parts, a lot of the same sighting systems and what have you as the T-55. So really the big jump was the new gun. The driver didn't get anything new, nor did the commander, but the gunner did get a new sighting system, which had as much as 7 times magnification, so that was useful. The gun was rated out to 4 kilometers, although at that range accuracy was pretty meh. Although at night it could only work out to about 1 kilometer, even less because, well, late 50s, early 60s Soviet night vision. Anyway, the politics side of it, but the programs were kind of progressing in 1961, and then the Grand Marshal, the Marshal General of the Soviet Army, pretty much evaluated, wasn't happy with the Morozov 430, even though the bureaus told him, look, we're working on an improved version that's going to do a lot better, the 432, time was up. So that was kind of put on the side, and the Object 166 was ordered into production. Interestingly, while that would become the T-62, the Object 165 would also be put into production because they just weren't sure about this here gun. And again, the 165 had a rifle gun still, so not very different from the later T-55s. It was put into service as the T-65A, and briefly both were produced concurrently, but already by March-April of 1962, after the first batch of T-62s were delivered, the T-62A was discontinued, so very few were actually made. And it was put into production, and it was hoped to be a solid replacement, a solid upgrade for the T-55. After all, it had a more powerful gun, slightly better armor, slightly higher top speed, a few other bibs and bobs, and Russia was happy to export it. The problem was very few countries were happy to purchase it. Here they are together, the T-55 and the T-62, and you can be forgiven for not telling them apart at first glance. The differences really are quite minor. Again, we have a new shape to the turret, and notice that the fume extractor is in the middle of the barrel versus being at the end here. Both can have a couple of spare fuel tanks on the back. The road wheels are positioned a little differently. They did improve their positioning. Still 5 main pairs, but they did rearrange them a bit to be a little more effective. But yeah, these were shown off to Warsaw Pact nations, and most of them would pass because this cost quite a bit more than the T-55, and the benefits just didn't seem worth it to them. Plus, they were unsure of the new gun because while it did have many advantages, it had a couple of noteworthy disadvantages. And of course, new and required its own ammo and what have you. It's also interesting. They had 40 rounds on board, but only 4 of them were stowed ready in the turret to go. The rest had to be collected from around the tank. It was a manually loading breech, but it was automatic ejection, kind of out the port of the back of the turret. And it was fully stabilized in both axes. Of course, we have a standard 4-man crew. And while a 12.7mm heavy machine gun was an optional feature, it actually was not made standard until 1971, 1972, much as had been done with the T-55. Again, helicopters coming into use. Poland and Czechoslovakia would evaluate the T-62, but would ultimately pass. In fact, the only major export successes within the Warsaw Pact were with Bulgaria. They would purchase about 250 in the early and mid-70s. North Korea, while not part of the European Pact, would not only purchase some T-62s, they would actually produce these under license, and as far as I know, we're the only country to do so. A few more T-62s would go to places like Iraq and some third world nations, but yeah, it wasn't that successful. Now, within the Soviet Army, it did replace a lot of T-55s and was used for several roles, including the motorized infantry, fire support, that kind of thing. But it was an intermediate tank, and everyone knew it. It was put into production at 2 factories, but they never canceled their T-55 production entirely. They just devoted some to the T-62. Again, it was very helpful that it used many of the same parts. But in the 70s, they would start transitioning away and in favor of like the T-72 and later designs. In fact, one factory would discontinue in 73, the other one would discontinue in 75. But the Russians had a lot of these, and they did see active combat. And the first time actually came in 1969 during a border skirmish with China, the Sino-Soviet border skirmish. These would be deployed for the first time in live combat and would do okay. Although, quite famously, one was knocked out by an RPG. It wasn't destroyed, but I believe it was the driver was killed. And so the tank was immobilized, and the Chinese captured it and stripped it apart, looking for new technologies. And these would be integrated into their next generation tank, the T-69, Type 69, I should say, to differentiate from Russian Ts. The next major use would come at the end of 1979, running through the 80s in Afghanistan. These would be pretty much the primary Soviet tank there for various reasons. They wanted to keep their more advanced tanks ready in Europe, so these were often sent to Afghanistan. Nearly 20,000 were produced in Russia. And again, since there were very few export takers, most of them would remain in the Soviet Army. For what it's worth, North Korea built between 2,000 and 3,000 themselves. But these were used in Afghanistan. They were used to kind of support and protect convoys, to support the infantry, and other roles. They were good enough, but their armor was really showing its age. They were quite vulnerable to RPGs, to landmines, and improvised explosions. No one knows how many were lost. The Soviets only admit that about 147 T-55s and T-62s were lost in Afghanistan, though the USA studies suggest that over 320 were lost. Not an insignificant number, just to be sure. And like most Soviet tanks of the era, survivability was kind of because ammunition wasn't stowed in vaults. So if armor were to be penetrated, these things could explode. But yeah, they were already out of production, but not at all out of service. And they would continue on into the post-Soviet era. In fact, it's estimated that about 2,000 were inherited by the new Russian Federation. In 1995, when they kind of did an assessment, about 750 were in active service. And these would be deployed, about 150 would be deployed in the Second Chechen War. They'd also be used in the First Chechen War. And around the turn of the millennium, they had about 200 left in active service, with more in reserve. Then the last major use, at least that we saw, came in 2008 with the Georgian War, where again at least one was lost to a rocket-propelled grenade. Yeah, these were not really designed for modern anti-tank weapons. So, yeah. And a few would kind of continue in frontline service for a little bit longer, but by 2013, Russia would retire them all, scrapping some, putting a few in mothballs, and kind of giving a few under the table to Syrian allies. Interestingly, while all of them were out of active service after this, in 2018, during a military exercise just to test readiness and response, Russian army units were ordered to get some T-62s ready. And yeah, there was also the T-62M, which was an updated version that appeared in the mid and late 80s and did see some use in the closing years of the Afghan war. And these would have kind of the earlier generation of reactive armor that we saw like on the T-72 and T-80. But the T-62A was only produced in very tiny numbers, so really you only have the one made variant, the T-62, with a few later on updates to the overall design. So very much an intermediate level tank, but not a bad one, just not a lot different from the T-55, frankly, except for the gun. And to be fair to the Design Bureau, it wasn't their fault. They actually offered an improved version before this even went into mass production as the Object 167. Among other things, it had an uprated engine, better engine, which would have helped the mobility a lot. But in 1961, the Russian government, the Soviet Army, was just eager to get something new into service and to kind of combat the M60 and newer tanks that would come along, like the British Chieftain that I've done a video on. And so it was a little bit rushed, and they knew that there would have to be compromises. But Morozov, that Design Bureau, the Object 432, it was waiting in the wings, and they were not about to give up on it. And next time, we will talk about the T-64, the so-called high-technology tank. But for now, I think we have done enough. Let me know what you think. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.